As for the Confederate government, the newly formed government would actually be largely modeled after the United States government. It's kind of ironic. You're fighting a war against your northern oppressor rather, and you're going to model your government largely after them. It's kind of interesting. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi and Alexander Stephens of Georgia would be nominated to be president and vice president, respectively, and shortly thereafter there'd be an election where they basically ran unopposed, and they would serve 6-year terms as agreed. Okay, so that's different than what you'd see within the American Constitution. The difference was in the Confederacy, you had a Constitution that was in large resemblance of the United States Constitution. It just basically made secession and slavery virtually impossible to go against. Okay? So, the Confederate Constitution made it virtually impossible to end slavery. That was going to be an institution. And you really gave the idea of states' rights a more firm ground with the Confederate Constitution. Okay? So, you're fighting a whole cult-like war for the preservation of states' rights. We're going to preserve our peculiar institution. No one's going to tell us against. So basically, you have to capitulate to the idea that some states in your country, if you will, aren't going to toe the country line. Well, you're fighting for a war for preservation to rule that cause. So it's kind of that double-edged sword the Confederacy is now going to have. So if Confederate military commanders in North Carolina don't want to send their troops to the other side of the Confederacy to help preserve the Western Front, you have to recognize that, right? After all, that's North Carolina's right to preserve their own troops, right? Problem. Okay. Otherwise, though, as Confederate troops found it difficult to feed themselves, the federal government in the Confederacy allowed for the idea of there being a food draft. That's to where basically slaves could be impressed into service for the Confederate war effort, not necessarily as troops, but as those serving food and other types of rations to Confederate troops. Confederate troops also now had the authority to go onto various different farmland and take crops for their own need to help feed themselves. Okay, we talked about how the Union paid for the war. How does the Confederacy pay for their war effort? They tried to levy a federal income tax among Southern people in Confederate society. That would actually be a very, very, very small aspect of money that they levied for it. The Confederacy was incredibly fledgling, but they did have a print press. So, over the course of the next 4 years, the Confederacy printed the equivalent of about $1.5 billion in print money. You actually can see a whole trade in modern day society to uncover old Confederate money. If you watched anything like American Pickers or the Gold and Silver Exchange, you might see Confederate money actually go for quite a lot. It's actually a historical, it's highly desirable to have old Confederate money. It's worthless from the standpoint of the time, the 1860s, but nowadays they're part of American history. Confederate money are highly sought after. Okay, so Pawn Stars and American Pickers, they might come across Confederate money. It could go for something. Okay. It also goes to show that the population, being sympathetic to the Confederate cause, saw a large number of young men volunteer for Confederate Army service. But when they still had a troop shortage, the Confederate federal government had to discuss the idea of, just like the North, there being a conscription, a draft, if you will, a forced service. So you had a number of Southerners who were going to volunteer anyway, but then there were some others, especially as the war dragged on for the next several years, who gave pushback, who kind of saw the idea that the South wasn't really winning this thing and they didn't want to be forced into service. But what do you do? Okay? There had to be a cause and you had to have something to drive troops. So, other things came into play as well. The Southern economy was very largely centered around cotton. Well, you're no longer trading with northern states because you're your own country now and you're fighting a war against the North. So you're not sending cotton to the North. You're not sending it to textile mills in Massachusetts and New York. And the Union Navy has blockaded much of the Confederate coast. And they have won various different battles out west that's taken control of the Mississippi River. So, England, France, other places around the world that might perhaps buy Confederate cotton, well, they're blocked. 95% of your cotton output cannot leave the Confederacy. So what do you have to do in order to establish productivity and economic growth? Now all of a sudden you're going to have to start developing textile mills and other things in the South to rebuild your economy into something other than just cotton. You got some big time problems there. That's one of the many reasons why putting all your eggs in one economic basket can be potentially disastrous. When your basket is blocked or otherwise unable to be carried, you got a problem. So the South had to reestablish various different things as well. Okay. They also had a problem with slaves perhaps escaping into freed states or otherwise northern territories. You had that Emancipation Proclamation that would eventually make its way to Confederate slave plantations and be a cause for ruckus. Now, it is true, you did have a number of African American slaves who would enlist in the Confederate Army and serve for the Confederate cause. That is true. Okay? It wasn't anything as close to African Americans who fought and served in the Union Army, but there were a small number of African Americans who did subscribe and enlist in the Confederate Army service. Okay? That was potentially done to alleviate troop shortage in the very last years of the war. As you had a waning war effort, you saw a need for those maybe to serve Confederate troops or actual troops themselves. But they were largely fewer in between. Okay. Oddly enough, around this time, baseball was beginning to take root in American recreational society. You had Union and Confederate troops who would often play baseball in their downtime. Nowadays, we think of baseball and it's like, wow, the Rangers have a brand new ballpark with a roof over it now. Wrigley Field is an old-timey baseball park. Fenway Park in Boston, Chavez Ravine, Dodger Stadium, Yankee Stadium. You have all kinds of baseball is a big deal. Well, it has its roots in the Civil War era. Okay. Other things that women also were involved in, not just in nursing, but also the idea that Southern women in particular, whose husbands were out, their fathers, their brothers, their nephews, Southern women had to tend to the farm. And as you had a more agrarian and rural society in the South, you had to have women take on more traditional male roles of the time. Tending to the farm, tending to the animals, the ranches, the farm work, slave hands. They had to take on more of those roles, all the while providing for their families and feeding their children and taking care of things. Southern women had it pretty tough. This idea of a Southern woman being a Southern belle Yeah, that's there, but for most Southern women, you'd see a rise in the grit and resilience and toughness that would come about as a result of males being gone off to fight a war, presumptively for a losing cause, too, while they're at it. Many men wouldn't come back, but that was the reality of the situation. So women, especially in the South, were really starting to take hold.